Greetings to you, dear listeners, and welcome to Negotiating Ideas, a podcast on political thought, on democracy, pluralism, and liberty. This is your host, Omar. In this episode, I talked to Scott Worden, who is Director of Afghanistan and Central Asia Programs at the U.S. Institute of Peace. At his previous time with USIP, Scott directed rule of law development programs for the USIP and served as United Nations appointed Electoral Complaints Commissioner for the 2009 Afghanistan elections, as well as advising the UN on elections in 2005 and 6. His article Afghanistan and Elections Gone Awry was published by Journal of Democracy in 2010. Another article titled Political Stability in Afghanistan, A Vision for 2020 was published by USIP in 2017. At this episode, I discuss with Scott the state of democracy in past 20 years of Afghanistan. Scott, welcome to Negotiating Ideas. Let me start by asking you the question, how do you examine post-2001's democracy of Afghanistan?
Thanks for having me on, and it's a good question and a big question. I think I would start by saying that contrary to conventional wisdom or a lot of people's opinions who haven't worked in Afghanistan, Afghanistan is actually a ripe country for democracy. I think there are long-standing traditions of group decision-making, consensual decision-making, shures and jirgas, which are, as you know, the tribal councils that have traditionally governed and decided on local disputes are fundamentally inclusive, although traditionally not of women. But these mechanisms and the mentality of a lot of Afghans are, I think, really conducive for democratic decision making. So I don't think it was a big stretch to have a democratic system as was adopted in the 2004 Constitution. I also, not being part of the 2004 drafting process, understand it to have been very much an Afghan decision. And this was what a wide range of political leaders, even Mujahideen leaders who had fought wars before, supported and wanted as the best possible system for choosing Afghan leadership. So this was an idea that was a good one, that was an Afghan one, that was indigenous, and I think had a lot of potential for success. It has failed for now with the takeover of the Taliban, but I think it has a future in Afghanistan as well. So I want to say that first. I think then when you get to more the specifics of what happened, the broadest answer I would give is that while the Constitution had a full democratic system as the means of government, and there was a lot of investment in the election processes, there was not a lot of investment in building the institutions of democracy and also in public education about democracy. And so you wound up having many elections. They were overshadowed by allegations of fraud, by actual fraud. And elections themselves became the focal point of democracy, and they were deeply flawed. But instead, what wasn't built up was this understanding of constituent service, of representation, and the machinery that underpins democracy, which elections are an end point and a starting point of, but it was missing a middle where the elected leaders actually saw their constituents as the source of their power, responded to constituents' need in a broad base, not just a narrow, corrupt base. And furthermore, that democratic systems were not reinforced through the donor community and donor systems. It was very much top down and outside of an elected platform in terms of making decisions, with a few notable exceptions like the community development councils. So I'll stop there, but those are some of the big reasons.
So just if I pick from what you highlighted, now we will move on to elections a bit later, but if we redesign, of course, Afghanistan will have a post-Taliban phase also. So if we redesign a democratic system for Afghanistan, how can we prevent the same pitfall that you mentioned in future?
Well, I think one of the key decisions that was made early on and then was perpetuated almost by default was to focus on the presidential elections first, then the
Mm,
parliament, and then to work on down to what was called for in the Constitution, which was even village elections. But of course, they had mayoral elections, mayoral municipal elections, and district councils, provincial councils. So it was a very top down model. Choose the leader, then work down, and they never got below the provincial council level. And frankly, for the provincial councils, while they were elected, they didn't have many powers or duties.
right.
So I think what I would do next time is focus a lot more on bottom up,
Mm,
because I see the electoral system, the system that was in the old constitution at least, as very much a pyramid, and it rests on a foundation of local democracy and local understanding. And frankly, while local forces in some cases are corrupt or abusive and can manipulate results, that was one of the reasons why that was given for not holding local elections. They were less observed and maybe more susceptible to corruption. But I think rather to the contrary, locally is how the people can both understand democracy, but
mm,
also hold it accountable, hold the system
right.
accountable.
Right.
We have big elections with big forces that was more easily manipulable. So I
Mm,
would, if not start from the bottom up, I would do it simultaneously so that
right.
people see and feel local democracy as the foundation of what they're doing nationally.
Right. It's an irony that some of these concepts has become quite problematic or politicized. If you talk about bottom up, well, in other words, you refer to empowering the local institutions, and
Yes.
that means, for example, decentralization of power. So, considering also the fact that in 2001 Afghanistan was not, for example, a fragmented country, which was not really, it didn't have established institutions. So one of the key logics back then was that, well, if you go bottom up, it will further reinforce fragmentation. Now, don't you think that in post-Taliban phase, well, the same scenario will repeat because Taliban has, to a large extent, disintegrated so many of these state institutions, and by the time they will be down of power, we may not be left with any institution.
Well, I think that's right. The Taliban eh, certainly are centrists, right? They not only want all power concentrated in either Kabul or Kandahar, they want it concentrated in an emir who's unelected. So it's really the antithesis of democracy or bottom up. Having said that, I think what the international community and the U.S. in particular underestimated was the local capacity of Afghans. I think a lot of attention was paid to, uh, let's say, education levels, technical skill levels, which indeed were quite low at the
Mm,
local level. And you need that. But at the same time, Afghanistan went through a horrible civil war, a horrible period of Taliban rule, uh, and there was a lot of resilience. I mean, there were
mm,
no social services, there were no government services, there was just government oppression. Unfortunately, I think we're trending in that direction again with the Taliban. They don't have
mm,
the technical skills, they don't have the money or the aid. So, in fact, Afghan communities are by necessity resorting to self reliance. And I
mm,
think that you have to respect and trust that to a greater degree when it comes time for hopefully a new rebuilding in terms of democracy and governance. And some communities will be distorted by local, let's say, corrupt forces or power brokers. But I think a majority of them will be able to fall back on their own resources that they will have necessarily used to survive the Taliban rule the second time. And so recognizing that capacity and finding ways to design democratic systems that harness that rather
mm,
than replace it is a key
mm,
principle. How to do that is very difficult. That involves consultation, that involves spending, I think, more time than was done in the 2001 to 4 period, understanding what exists, understanding the variability of that, and
mm.
designing systems of democracy that are flexible and adaptable to local circumstances, but still retain those core principles of participation, of representation, of equality.
Yeah, right. Apart from continuously in your writings, you have emphasized institutional reform, and apart from what should be done at the local level, you have also highlighted electoral reforms. And the system was flawed. A wrong model of electoral system was adopted, and that was one of the major factors towards fraud in the outcome. What is your opinion? What should be done? Of course, now there's no election, so there's no question of reform. We are probably thinking about everything from scratch. It's quite probably early on to ask this question also at this moment, but in a context like if conceptually we discuss in a context like Afghanistan, that SNTV has failed. What could be alternative?
Yeah, that's a good point. And indeed, I think one of the biggest flaws and failures of the election mechanism themselves was because SNTV, single non-transferable vote, was chosen as the mechanism. So clearly, something that a system. There are many options, but I think a system that is less winner take all, as a general principle, is needed. Afghanistan obviously is a pluralistic society; it's a multi-ethnic society, and there is and has been for the last many decades a strong association or linkage between ethnicity and politics. It's
Mm,
ethno-political factions that are the driving force behind politics, but really also behind war. So you have to account for this fact, and having a system that was SNTV really raised the stakes to a level that I think the weak institutions of democracy couldn't handle. I don't think there's an obvious right answer as to what alternative you use. I mean, it really depends, but we know that the SNTV
mm,
is the wrong answer. That
mm,
much is
mm,
clear.
mm,
I think that fundamentally, and where electoral reform commissions really got stuck is, do you have smaller districts with single member representation that can account for the diversity of ethnopolitical views within a given province or even in the country? Um, or do you have proportional representation that has a group of legislators, more like what the current provincial council and parliament have from an area, but you have voting rules that ensure that even minority voters will get a candidate elected?
mm, mm,
And the answer, both can work. Both, I think, account for the central problem of having a diverse electoral constituency, but only one winner for that constituency, essentially. The question is, how can you fairly, if you're going to focus on districts, how do you fairly do that? We're speaking in the U.S. right now, where gerrymandering, where we're
mm.
designing and drawing district lines in a way that determines the outcome, is a big problem. So if you have a fair decider of drawing those lines, I think single member districts, evenly or fairly apportioned, can be a solution. Otherwise, you need a system that gets a slate of representatives for a given area that are in fact diverse.
Well, this was controversial, even options beyond SNTV. And the Special Electoral Reform Commission, which was established after National Unity Government, you have discussed how this controversy emerged over some of the political elite favoring a single member district kind of system, the others didn't. And eventually, two of the participants in the commission boycotted. Um, it seems throughout national unity, but also any kind of discussion over democratic reform was hijacked by political elite sitting in Kabul and trying to hold on the entire process. So it's not just about a technical expertise, which one is better, which one is not. It's also about political bargaining between a bunch of elite who have vested interests, either from an ethnic point of view or other. Now, a post-conflict society or a fragmented society like Afghanistan have to deal with such kind of political bargaining also, and Afghanistan never overcome such kind of bargaining, ethnic bargaining between elites in Kabul. So we have to also, I think, if it's about electoral reforms, something beyond that, how to contain or secure the interest of major political elites. And this might repeat, of course, in any other phase also of Afghanistan, come back to the same cycle of discussion and reform. Don't you think?
Yes, I think that's true. And I think that you had a really almost tragic situation unfolding in the realm of electoral reform over the 20-year, really 15-year practice of democracy in Afghanistan, where it became increasingly clear to everyone, including elites, that the current system was not serving Afghanistan well and not achieving legitimate or perceived as legitimate outcomes. On the other hand, the people that were deciding on the reform had a vested interest because they were in a decision-making position as a result of this flawed system. So I think there was this paradox almost where the deciders could see there was a problem, but they didn't want a new system that might result in them losing power. So, if we can look for a silver lining and anticipate if not the fall of the Taliban, a pivotal moment in the future when a democratic constitution can be revived or renegotiated, that might be a point of more political equilibrium where there aren't so many vested interests from the old flawed system deciding on the reform. I think that, there was also this dual role of the international community. On the one hand, I think there is valid criticism, and I say that having been working for the UN on elections. So there's valid criticism that the international community intervened too much in the electoral process. I think it was more about the US and other particular countries' political leaders than the UN, but still there was a desire to nationalize, as it should be, and make fully sovereign the electoral system. On the other hand, there clearly was this inability for political leaders, the political system in Afghanistan, to make tough decisions, and they defaulted to the worst possible outcome because nobody could agree on a way forward. So I think that what I'm trying to say is that there is a role for mediation, neutral mediation over these kinds of disputes, where you can agree on first principles. Should there be a system that allows one particular ethnic group to rule, almost exclusively over the diverse polity of Afghanistan? I think most people would say no, and on principle, it's hard to say yes, even if you secretly prefer that. So, starting from those principles, one would hope for a reasoned negotiation to say, okay, here's options, and then here's how to implement them. So, in the future, maybe there can be that maybe more clean slate examination of what system would account for the political realities of Afghanistan and the desire for an equitable share of power.
But also, this also reminds me of the National Unity Government Agreement, wherein, based on what you proposed, certain principles were agreed and overall, wherein the neat and clean, the other components of it were quite vague. The agreement was few pages. It didn't address adequately all the disputes. And what happened at the end of the day, again, that was again hijacked by political elite, and that somehow prevented reform.
It did. And, I think this also speaks to some of the really fundamental elements of a democratic system or even a governance system, whether it's involving elections. I mean, that's the mechanisms of accountability. And I think that Afghan society, if I can say this as an outsider, has a very keen sense, an innate sense of accountability. And it doesn't mean that the systems that are designed or implemented are accountable ones, but there's a sense of fairness and accountability. And I say that as my first point because I think one of the big problems of the Unity Government Agreement, obviously, was enforcement. I mean, that's the point that you're getting at. There was an agreement that had, let's say, fair principles that were agreeable. They were violated, I think, in practice, it can be said. And I hope that's not seen as a partisan statement. But who made the agreement, apart from Dr. Abdullah and President Ghani? It was the U.S. that brokered it. And it was John Kerry and it was politicians that came in. But then they tried to walk away. The attitude was, well, look, we were a pure mediator. Obviously, the U.S. had a conflicted role in terms of our troops on the ground, our national interests, and so forth. But we really brokered this agreement. But then when it came to enforcement,
Yeah.
we said, well, that's an Afghan matter, and it's really between Abdullah and Ghani and other Afghan political actors. And I think that the sense of accountability, and maybe even my own, but certainly my understanding from visiting frequently, talking to Afghans being involved, is everybody was then looking to the U.S. to enforce the agreement because we made the agreement, and that's this inherent sense of accountability. And the U.S. didn't understand that or agree to those terms, and I think that's unfortunate because if you make the agreement, there needs to be somebody to enforce it.
Enforce it. No,
And
no,
it seems
you're
obvious it
quite
should have been the U.S.
you're quite right on that. The literature on civil war and conflict resolution also, one of the key approaches is bargaining challenge. And the bargaining challenge, or for example, scholars like Barbara Walter argues that enforcement problem on anyway comes when it comes to internal disputes in a state and intra-state disputes. And because the parties do not have enforcement mechanisms, one of them might be, for example, the state, the other party is not the state. They don't have army, or they have to demobilize, for instance. So at the end of the day, they don't trust each other. And hence there are high chances that such kind of disagreements will lead to a civil war. And Afghanistan was on the brink of civil war at the time that National Unity Government Agreement was about to sign. Of course, lack of guarantees, and the US couldn't enforce that agreement. But probably the mechanism should have been outlined clearly on the agreement, and also the authorities, that to what extent President Ashraf Ghani had the authority, because he continuously invoked again the constitution and the state of the agreement, or the other opponent, Dr. Abdullah, to what extent he had the authorities. So it was a question of enforcement and credibility and guarantees of the enforcement, but also to the extent that the content of the agreement failed to elaborate on division of power or power sharing. It was a power sharing agreement, but it did not outline what powers are shared between these two parties.
Yes, I think that entirely makes sense and explains so much of it. I would also say, the U.S. who brokered that agreement, international community more broadly, was in a very difficult position because one of the reasons I think there was not a more clear enumeration of the mechanisms to implement, but also then enforcement of possible violations of the agreement, is that the leaders themselves, I think, on a lot of sides, those two, but even if you look at other political disputes that were mediated or brokered by the international community, the message was very much, give me power and then walk away. So the leaders themselves, I think, were very conscious and afraid of accountability. And obviously it was a delicate situation where the international community is trying to get out of Afghanistan, hopefully, obviously in a stable context, not in the way that it unfolded, but it was this, yes, come in. I want to draw you into the problem. I want to attract you to my side. You get some of your power so that I can come out ahead and then really go away. And that's a very difficult role to play. But not playing it obviously had big consequences.
Right. So it also brings me to this question: to what extent political leaders at top were somehow doing injustice to institutions, both democracy and also liberalism. Particularly if we speak about post-National Unity Government, President Ashraf Ghani, do you consider him as an illiberal politician who violated, for example, liberals' principle of rule of law, for example, or neutrality, or anti-democratic, wherein they violated, of course, with fraudulent elections and so many other principles of democracy which were violated? This is somehow relevant in the US also, and now to what extent it's polarized, that President Trump calling the MAGA and pro-Trump electorate as a semi-fascist, somehow demeaning them or all that. But this kind of question in academia is to whether we have presidents or politicians who are illiberal. For example, Trump is an illiberal or anti-democratic. What do you sense in context of Afghanistan?
Well, that's a loaded question. I don't want to opine on whether someone is liberal or illiberal, but I do think there were serious problems with how President Ghani, but also President Karzai, used the office of the presidency in relation to building democratic institutions or not. And I would point to a couple key flaws or key problems for institutionalizing and perpetuating, deepening, strengthening democracy. One is that they did not form their own political party and they actively discouraged the formation of political parties. I find this a little bit odd. So, one reason that you mentioned earlier, the single non-transferable vote system, because of its mechanics, is disadvantage. It disadvantages political parties. So the system itself discouraged it. True, but even having said that, I mean, in any democratic system, I mean, there's huge powers of incumbency when you're running for reelection, but you enhance that, and even once your term is over, you create a party, and hopefully it competes fairly. Usually the problem is you create a party and then it dominates other parties because of unfair advantages that the incumbent imposes. But neither Karzai nor Ghani sought to create any political party whatsoever. They personalized the presidency in doing so, and that makes transitions very difficult and makes elections even more contentious when you don't have a party structure with a platform, with a constituency, with a broad base to underpin your governing philosophy. So I think that's one move that was really unfortunate and destructive. The other thing is, of course, the Constitution, the 2004 Constitution in particular, but all democratic constitutions, there's a relationship, a fundamental check and balance between the executive authority embodying the presidency, or otherwise the prime minister, and the parliament, right? There's the legislature, elected legislative president, there's balance. That never got achieved in Afghanistan. And I think there's a lot of faults to throw around. I think partly donors underinvested in that part of the democratic architecture. Corrupt elections, corrupt politicians perpetuated it. But at the presidential level, both presidents, and I think Ghani, maybe even more, really sought to avoid the legislature and rule by executive order or decree. And so this again is a fundamental disrespect for democracy. Yes, the parliament was corrupt. Yes, it's difficult to get anything done. Yes, it was an emergency situation, and decrees are often more expedient. But that doesn't excuse the overwhelming pattern of sidelining the legislature and only engaging with it in an extremely transactional and often corrupt way. So that's another big flaw. I think then finally, the centralization of the state. I mean, this is a political science debate. It's a state formation debate that has good arguments on both sides. But the dilemma for Afghanistan is that it is traditionally, obviously under the monarchy, had a centralized system that is concentrated in Kabul. You have vastly different opinions and conditions in the countryside. And on the one hand, in theory, and this was certainly President Ghani's theory, if you have a technocratic, capable center, you can modernize more quickly because that's where the skills are and the know-how, and then you can push that out, and you can theoretically push it out in a rapid fashion and make a big leap forward in terms of development. But Afghanistan, certainly in the last 20 years, if not ever, has lacked the capacity to actually implement that central system. And so President Ghani, more and more concentrated power within the office of the president and made all of these executive decisions from there, but didn't have, because of the insurgency, but also because of resources, and also because of the lack of a political network, didn't have the means to actually make it happen in so much of the country. I think this then started a cycle, or continued a cycle, of alienation where, apart from the insurgency was a big factor, Taliban tried to cut the people off from the government. They did so effectively. But even where it wasn't because of the Taliban, you had ineptitude, incapacity, let's say, of achieving any of the reforms. So people didn't see that. And then when they read headlines about flawed, fraudulent, filled elections and saw nothing coming to them from the government, what is there to support? So I think it was, in some ways, a death spiral of democracy by trying to over centralize without the capacity or the means to actually implement.
Well, unlike the brand of Ghani, what he is famously called as a technocrat, I think he excessively misused his discretion to appoint political appointees and bypass the logic of technocracy and impartiality of bureaucracy. Why was this? I'm wondering that this was a trend, I think, under President Karzai also, but something which is resemblant in the history of United States under the era of President Andrew Jackson. So the big question is, Ghani was not a technocrat in practice, and he bypassed all of these logics and principles by appointing all political appointees from top to bottom.
I think strong tendency across the system for power brokers, in whatever form they attain power, to seek the appointment mechanism rather than elected. And I think it's because somebody with an actual constituency, whether it's a formal election or if it's a consensus choice, if it's a local choice, they've got a base of political power, and that's a threat. And particularly if you're appointed and others have a power base that is consensual, you're not a warlord. That's a rival to power. And I think there is this contest. Maybe this is a bigger issue also to think about in terms of the last 20 years of democracy in Afghanistan. The patronage system, which is ingrained throughout, versus a more representative and chosen by the people system. I think there is obviously competition for power between those two, and you get different leaders. So maybe that was an underappreciated challenge. But indeed, I think back to one of my first points, I think there are strong traditions of fairness, participation, and inclusive decision making, particularly at the local level, that show that the patronage model is not inherent or endemic to Afghanistan. It's just something that tends to reward those who are in power.
So, and how do you see the civic engagement, cultural civic engagement in Afghanistan, given the fact that you're referring how at the local level there are norms, traditions of democratic deliberation, maybe at different level. Afghanistan also somehow formalized a certain form of civil society institutions in the last 20 years that we see the remnants of it now converting into a social movement, challenging the Taliban. To what extent the civil society institutions were competent enough and that they inculcate certain form of civic culture into the people and citizens?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that as far as the donor sponsored democratic related civic outreach that was funded, it was all about elections and election mechanics. It was how to vote, how to register to vote, and so forth. Less was done, and I think this is fundamentally the job of the government, of the national government. Less was done to explain why to vote. What is the role of an elected official? What powers do they have? What role do you have as a citizen to hold them accountable? Which is not just at the ballot box. Obviously, there's in a functioning democracy. I mean, there's a whole ecosystem, if you will, of communication between the citizens and the elected representatives, and the media then obviously plays a key role in that communication. So I think that I'm not aware of much intentional communication from any source to really explain that. That's one problem. But even if you explain it, that messaging will quickly fall flat if it's not seen to be working in practice. And so this is maybe the more fundamental issue, which is that the mechanisms, the purpose of the elected officials was never really realized. Partly because there were no local elections, so actually understanding at the community level what the needs were and then communicating that to the government that's supposed to provide resources to allocate according to needs. I mean, that system never really worked. It was much more about, going to an appointed official, and then if they had connections, you could get resources, and if they didn't have connections, you couldn't. So, well, let me say another story that really, I think, encapsulates the problem and was such a surprise. So when I first was working in Afghanistan, it was in 2005 elections for the Joint Election Management Body, and I was in the legal department. And this was the parliament and the provincial council elections. And the candidate nomination period for provincial council started before they passed the provincial council law. And the response was overwhelming. There were 2,500 people, if I remember correctly, nationwide that put themselves forward to be a provincial councillor without having any idea what the duties were.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, as a demand signal, people wanted to participate. Maybe they thought they could dole out patronage, but still, there was great interest in the system. Then when the law actually got passed after they were nominated, and nobody really dropped out, the powers were essentially meaningless. There was no real authority in the provincial council. They didn't have a budget line that they could control. And it was basically to give advice to the governor and to the line ministries. And, that could be taken or left. So my point is that it's not just about saying, look, these provincial councillors, you're electing them because they're your representatives and here's how it's supposed to work. But it's also, you need to put in the law an actual budget authority. Now, this at the provincial level requires some decentralization, but one way or another, you can't just put on paper these institutions with no powers and no responsibilities and expect the system to work.
Thank you, Scott, for joining me on this podcast.
Thanks very much for having me.
And finally, thanks to you, dear listeners, for listening to this conversation. Looking forward to speaking to you on the next episode.